Hello again, and welcome to Analyzing Literature. I'm your host, Mr. Miniman, and today we're going to be looking at how to analyze the setting. As you are probably already aware, the setting is made up of two components, although one of them generally gets more attention. That first one is where the story takes place, its location, but the second one is when the story takes place. So the setting is the combination of where and when the story takes place. Keep in mind the when is often as important as the where. If I give you two books and say they both take place in New York City, then you might think that they have a similar setting. But if book A takes place in New York City in 1826 and the second book takes place in New York City in the year 2050, those are going to be two completely different books. So the when is important too. Don't overlook it. When you look at how an author introduces a setting, you're going to want to look at a few primary techniques that the author might employ. The first is imagery. The author will often describe how the setting looks using imagery, or how it feels, or how it sounds. Remember, imagery is any description that appeals to the senses, not just the sense of sight, but also the sense of hearing, of smell. Another technique would be mood. In the description of the setting, what kind of mood is the author establishing? That will give you a baseline on whether this is a positive setting, a negative setting. A dystopian book will describe the setting with a very oppressive, harsh mood, whereas another book might take place in a beautiful landscape. So the mood is important because the author is trying to capture how you're supposed to feel about the setting. Another way you can see an author using techniques to develop the setting is looking at how it affects the protagonist or other characters. If it affects the protagonist in a negative way, then it's probably a negative setting. And that's the way the author wants you to think about it. Another thing to consider is whether the setting is a real place or a fictional place. If it's a real place, the author will usually give you clues to tell you where and when we are in time, and you're going to need to use your knowledge of that time period and that place to give the book more context. If it's a fictional place, then the author's going to spend a lot of time establishing the world, describing things, getting you into the world that they're creating for you. The example we're going to look at from To Kill a Mockingbird definitely takes place in a real setting. Now, Macomb is not a real place in Alabama, but it's definitely based on real southern towns. It's not some fantastical place with flying cars or anything. It's based on reality. And she gives us a clue in this passage about when we are in time. So let's turn our attention to Kill a Mockingbird. This is how Harper Lee introduces the setting of her novel. She says, "Macomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks, the courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 a.m. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macomb County. But it was a time of vague optimism for some of the people. Macomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. So I'm going to take a minute and annotate this passage, and I'll be right with you. There we go. Primarily what I'm trying to think about as I look through this passage is, what is Harper Lee trying to tell me? What is the author trying to communicate to me? How are they trying to get me to feel about the setting in this description? So I noticed a lot of imagery in the first paragraph. A lot of it was about the heat, but also some of it seemed to be about poverty, like the bony mules, as if the mules aren't being fed enough. Later on in the second paragraph, it says there was no money to buy anything with. So I'm getting this idea of poverty. The heat obviously comes from the fact that we're in the South. She mentioned earlier that we were in Alabama. And then she gives us an idea of the people in the second paragraph. People moved slowly then. There was a slower lifestyle. The day was 24 hours, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go and nothing to buy and no money to buy it with. So you get this impression of this small town in the rural South. The third paragraph says, but it was a time of vague optimism for some of the people. Well, why only some of the people? That's something we find out later. Of course, she's talking about African Americans probably don't have any vague optimism. But the next sentence is actually pretty key to understanding when we are. Macomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. Now that's a phrase I've heard before, nothing to fear but fear itself. So a quick Google search, and I learned that it's from a speech by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his 1933 inauguration. So suddenly I know, since they were recently told this, that we are in 1933, which is, based on my knowledge of American history, the midst of the Great Depression. So that's probably why people didn't have any money and why the mules are so bony. If I put all that stuff together, then I get a pretty good impression of this town, Macomb, where the rest of the book is going to take place. Now on to my notebook entry. So I got to remember my main things. I got to label and date my entry. I can't summarize in my entry. I've got to provide a quote, a citation, and it should be 5 sentences minimum. All right, let me write this thing. All right, let's see if I did all the things I needed to do. Label and date, check. Don't summarize. I don't think I did. We'll take a look at that in a second. Quote, cite text. Got it right here. 5 sentences. I have 5 sentences. Notice I didn't include this one, the one with the quote, because it doesn't really have an original idea in it. All I did was provide the quote. Okay, so I said, Harper Lee sets the beginning of To Kill a Mockingbird in Macomb, Alabama in 1933. Based on her initial description, Macomb is a small, slow-moving southern town. She writes, there was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with. Page 5. Clearly, Macomb is not exactly a bustling metropolis. Life in Macomb was probably pretty dull, in fact. In 1933, the U.S. was struggling through the Great Depression, which explains why she says people didn't have any money. So I know this isn't all summary because I came to some conclusions, like I inferred, based on the information provided, that life would probably be pretty dull in Macomb. I also figured out that we're in the middle of the Great Depression in the book. So I used her description to come to some conclusions. I thought about it. If you do something similar in your reader's notebook, you'll do a great job. Mindeman out.